Michelle, once a buyer or seller goes under contract, the offer and purchase goes to the attorney's office, one of the first things that happens. And many buyers and sellers have no idea what happens at the attorney's office once we send the offer over to you and schedule a closing date. So, can you, first of all, I'd like to ask you, because in some states you don't have to have an attorney to close, but in North Carolina you do. Can you tell us why we have an attorney
Sure.
in the closing process?
Yeah, actually, North Carolina has just decided it would be best for the consumer if an attorney represented them. In many states where settlement companies will handle the closings, they still have to hire an attorney to do preparation of documents. So they still have an attorney involved, it's just they don't have to be the one explaining the documents at the closing table. So there is usually an attorney involved somewhere along in the process. Some states they help negotiate the contracts and they don't use brokers and realtors to do that. Some states they just use them to prepare documents. In North Carolina, we said we just want the attorney to oversee the entire process. And as far as what happens once we get the contract from you, the first thing that we need to do is we need to do a title search. And the title search tells me what the title is about the property. And most people don't even know what that means. It tells me who owns it and whether or not they have any liens or mortgages against the property. The importance of that is now I know, wow, I have to get payoffs for these mortgages, or this seller has a lien against the property. So in order to transfer clear title to the buyer, we need to figure out what we have to do to get rid of that lien. Sometimes we find there's delinquent taxes or judgments as well. So until we do a title search, we don't really know what has to be taken care of at the closing. So the first step that we like to take is that title search to see what we have to deal with.
Get that ordered right away so there's not any problems towards the end. Now, why is it important? Well, you've already covered why is it important to do a title search, but why does somebody need title insurance?
Title insurance is one of the cheapest forms of insurance. You can pay a couple $100s on a transaction and it insures you forever. And what title insurance does is it says to the buyer, I am insuring that as of the time that you purchase this property, there are no liens or judgments that are affecting this property other than the mortgage you might be taking out along with the purchase. And the reason that that's important is, let's just say some heir comes up years later and says, no, I actually own that property. Or even worse, somebody, a big bank comes up and they said, you know what, actually we have a valid mortgage against this property. The title insurance company would pay that lien mortgage off, or they would pay off that person who is stating that that property is theirs, and they paid a couple $100s for it at closing. Lenders also require it because it ensures the lender is able to foreclose on the property in case that person buying the home actually defaults on the loan. So it's something that's required for them to have at closing, but it also provides them a lot of protection for a really cheap dollar amount.
Okay, but do you have to have title insurance if you're a cash buyer?
You don't have to have title insurance, but I'd almost say it's malpractice not to put it in place for the buyer.
Okay. So it's a good idea to have it then.
Absolutely.
It's a cheap way to cover yourself for future issues.
Absolutely.
Many buyers will forego getting a survey just because of the expense. And why do you recommend that a survey be done?
We have found so many issues with survey that surprise us. And most people will say, especially if it's in a neighborhood, where there's a whole bunch of lots lined up on the street.
There's
And
fences.
they say, we know where the property lines are, we're not even worried about it. Well, sometimes we think that and we're just not right where those lines are. And we have found lots of pools that have been built over property lines. We have found lots of outdoor sheds that have been built over property lines. But some of the biggest problems that I found is actually with access issues. A lot of people will come up to a property and they will access it through a drive, and when they purchase the property, that drive becomes blocked. And they say, whoa, whoa, that's the driveway. Actually, that's not the legal access that you had to the property. That was a driveway that that guy's been using forever and ever and ever, but it actually wasn't the legal access to the property. By doing a survey, we find the legal access is maybe over here and it's overgrown by trees or brush, or there's no gravel on the road. They didn't even know that's where the access was. And so we found a lot of problems with access because we're not sure exactly where some of those old easements are. It might not be right where the road is that's being used. So I think surveys can be very valuable just to kind of show people exactly what's on their land and what is theirs that doesn't need to be on the neighbor's land as well.
Because even if a problem doesn't come up when you're purchasing and you didn't do a survey, because when you get ready to sell that property, if you didn't do a survey, then the problem might show up then, and then you would be
stuck dealing with it.
So
Absolutely.
it's better to get it taken care of before
Absolutely.
you purchase. And So it's probably money well spent.
Yeah, it's usually, it runs somebody $300 to $400. I would say, per an acre of land, just depending on how heavily wooded, what kind of topography we have that we have to deal with. And it's really one of those things, again, that doesn't cost a lot of money and can give you a lot of information about the piece of property that you're purchasing.
Now, do you have to have a survey for the title insurance to cover any issues with the survey?
Basically, what title insurance says is we're not going to cover anything that would have been revealed by a survey.
I see.
So they have a little exception on everybody's policy. So if we do a survey, they say, oh, we're going to insure everything because we've done a survey now and we don't see that there's any problems that you have. But without that survey, they will put an exception on your policy.
Okay. And tell us what happens as far as a lender is concerned before we can close the loan. I know that once you get the contract, you get information from the real estate agent as to who the lender is going to be for the buyer. And what do y'all do to make sure everything goes smoothly with the lender?
Absolutely. The first thing we have to do is contact them and tell them that we're going to be the one that's handling the closing, and we've already ordered a title search of the property, and they need the title insurance binder. Title insurance is something that's required by the lender, and that's part of their underwriting process for the loan. So they submit several things into underwriting to get approved. Some of the information comes from the borrower, like tax returns, W-2s, bank statements. Some of the stuff comes from the appraisal that goes out there, and then they need things from our office as well. They need to make sure that I'm properly insured and licensed, and then they want to make sure that I can get them title insurance and that they're not going to have any liens or defects on their policy. So we contact the lender, we make sure that they're up to speed, that they know that it's us that's handling the transaction. We ask them how much the borrower is going to be borrowing so that we can put that information on the title insurance and get that over to them. That would hold up the underwriting of the loan if they don't have that information. So we want to get that to them as soon as possible. And when we're still waiting for them to give us the loan amount, we know they're not quite ready to go to closing, which kind of gives us some information that we can pass back to the realtor as well.
Right, because if the loan package isn't ready, we can't close.
Can't do anything at all.
That's really a lender issue, not an attorney issue.
Right. As soon as we get them, we try and print them. They're sent by email, and we shoot them out to our printer, and we're ready to go.
And typically, how many days in advance do you get the package?
Days in advance would be nice. I would say typically we get them 1 to 2 hours before closing. That's the average. And there are some loan packages that could take 30 or 45 minutes to print, just because they're coming from encrypted websites and they have to download and then they have to go out to the printer. And so there's sometimes where even though we have it, we hit the print button, it's 45 minutes before we pull it off the printer. And if we get that an hour and a half before closing, everybody's kind of, a little create some anxiety for the borrower.
Absolutely. And I know when we close, we have to have a settlement statement. It's called the HUD-1, and a lot of people, that's the first time they've ever heard that term, HUD-1, and that's what we talk about a lot. But why do we have to use that form for closing?
It's all required by federal law. There is RESPA, which is Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, and it says a whole bunch of things that us as closing agents have to do. And one of the things that we have to do whenever there is a loan involved is we have to use the HUD-1 form. So there's a couple software companies out there that said this is how we're going to make some software so that you can plug all the data in and it'll show it properly on the form. A long time ago, we actually used to do them by hand and add them up, and it's much easier now that the computer does all the adding for us. But it's just a federally required form.
Okay. Also, one other thing that might be different for buyers and sellers in North Carolina, if they've ever closed anywhere else, most of the time the money is exchanged at the closing table. That's when it's dispersed. But in North Carolina, it's different.
Right.
It's not dispersed until the deed is recorded. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There are very few states, I think there's only 2 or 3 out of 50 that are race states, and what that means is the race to the courthouse. The first one that gets there and puts it on record wins. So what we have to do is we're not allowed to record, we're not allowed to disperse until we've put it on record, until we've recorded. Because in theory, a seller could also have executed a deed to another buyer and sold it to them minutes before they came in and sold it to your client, and whichever one got it up to the courthouse first is the one that the seller technically sold the property to. So we have to run up there and we have to update the records. What the biggest problem that we have today is waiting on this thing called permission to fund, which a lot of people do not understand. The buyer is borrowing money from a bank, and that bank sends money into my trust account. I am not allowed to use that money until they have told me I can do so. It's not my money,
Right.
it's their money. So unfortunately, some of the requirements or how I can do so take a little bit longer than they should. It should be a sending back of signed documents after closing. They review them, they say you're now okay, you can go up to the courthouse. However, sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that. Sometimes they say, oh, we forgot to send you this, please call the borrower back in and have them sign. Meanwhile, people are waiting to exchange keys and get their checks in the lobby.
Right.
So once we have that permission to fund, we're allowed to run up there and put it on record. Unfortunately, we can't disperse any monies at all until we've done so according to the law.
Well, it's obvious that the closing process is pretty complicated, and it's important that you have a good closing attorney to handle the process.
Of course, I would agree with that.
So, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you sharing with me today.
Absolutely, anytime.
Thank you.
Sure.